When the government is increasing spending in a time of recession, then they are trying to fight the recession. They're trying to increase output and employment back to potential GDP levels. And so the increase in government spending as an intentional way to fight the recession is called a counter-cyclical policy. Pro-cyclical policies reinforce a cyclical trend like a recession. So if the economy was going into a recession, it would push it down even further into a recession, making things worse. It would be something like decreasing government spending in a time of recession. If you look at this graph, then let's imagine that the solid black line is the business cycle as it would happen without any policies implemented. A pro-cyclical policy, which makes things worse, would make the troughs even deeper and the peaks even higher. And it would follow, I guess, what mostly is that dotted blue line. I guess I couldn't get it all dotted blue. But the dotted black line that reflects the intent of a counter-cyclical policy, which is spelled incorrectly, counter-cyclical policy, not counter, is to even out the cycle and to not have your troughs go as deep or not have your peaks go as high. Because of the problems associated with running a budget deficit, as we've seen recently in the United States with all of the fiscal cliff problems, there have on occasion been politicians who have advocated for something called a balanced budget amendment, in which they advocate for some sort of mandatory balanced budget policy. In a balanced budget, it means that the tax revenue is equal to the government spending. So exactly what the government takes in taxes is exactly what they spend. They can't spend any more or any less, and it is illegal to run a deficit or a surplus for the budget for the year. And so tax revenue minus government spending has to equal zero. There are problems with running a balanced budget policy, namely that it ends up being pro-cyclical. The way that works is that if the economy is in a recession, by definition of recession, it means you're making less than potential GDP. So the unemployment rate is going to be higher, and with less people working and earning an income, the tax revenue that is collected as a percentage of personal income, that amount of tax revenue is going to be less than in non-recessionary times. So with the tax revenue collected being less because of the recession, government would have to decrease spending if there was a mandatory balanced budget policy. If you're decreasing government spending and it's already a recession, when we learned about pro-cyclical policies are those policies that actually make the recession worse. And so decreasing government spending in a time of a recession would qualify as a pro-cyclical policy, and a balanced budget policy would, in practicality, end up being pro-cyclical then. In times of demand pull inflation, it would work the opposite. In demand pull inflationary times, there's a lot of output being made, and there's a lot of people that are working, and so they're spending, which is causing the inflation. But with all the money that's out there and the income being earned, the amount of tax revenue the government collects is going to be higher than in non-demand pull inflationary times. And with that increased amount of tax revenue being collected, the government spending must also increase because tax revenue must equal government spending under a balanced budget policy. Increasing government spending in a time of demand pull inflation is going to make things worse, and therefore it is pro-cyclical. So what if the government wanted to spend $20 million, but in order to do it, they raised taxes by a lump sum amount of $20 million. So the increase in government spending is being funded by an increase in taxes of the same amount, what would be the overall impact on GDP? And some students will react too quickly and say that the overall impact on GDP would be nothing, that if you increase spending by 20 million but then increase taxes by the same amount, there'd be no change in GDP. But that answer is incorrect. The answer is that the GDP would increase by 20 million, or in other words, the aggregate demand curve, which would be translated right by $20 million. Let's say that the MPS in the economy is 0.2, which means that the spending multiplier is equal to 5, and the tax multiplier, which is always 1 less, is equal to 4. The increase in government spending of 20 million would increase GDP by 100 million because you take the 20 million times the spending multiplier, 5, and 20 times 5 is equal to 100. So it increases GDP by 100 million. But if they increase taxes by 20 million, this is going to decrease GDP by 20 million times the tax multiplier, 4. 20 times 4 is equal to 80 million. So the increase in government spending caused GDP to increase by 100 million, but the increase in taxes causes GDP to decrease by 80 million. The overall impact would be an increase of GDP by 20 million, which is the original amount of the government spending, 20 million. So we can summarize that whenever the government increases spending by a certain amount and then funds it by an increase in taxes by the same amount, the overall impact on GDP will be an increase by that same amount of the government spending. Because the difference between the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier is 1, tax multiplier equals spending multiplier minus 1, then any change in spending that's funded by an equal increase in taxes results in a change in GDP of the initial spending amount. Because that's the case, we say that the balanced budget multiplier is equal to 1. So a certain change in government spending times 1 equals the change in GDP if the change in government spending was funded by a change in taxes of the same amount. Look at the problem. The MPS in an economy is equal to 0.2375. If the government increased spending by $2,347.63 and also increased taxes by a lump sum amount of $2,347.63, what is the change in GDP? It seems at first that this would be an almost impossible math problem to do without a calculator, but if you notice that the change in spending is equal to the change in taxes, then it's an easy problem, and the change in GDP is the exact initial change in government spending amount of $2,347.63.